much to say about Alex because I read his papers. But I'll just say that when I was looking for a speaker for this series, I did read a lot of papers written by a lot of the great speakers we have in the Bay Area. And one thing that impressed me about Alex's research papers is that he wasn't afraid, he didn't shy away from some very controversial topics. And talking about diversity and talking about equity can be very controversial. You have to be brave. You have to be brave. And I felt Alex was really brave in some of his writing. So that's one thing that really drew me to choose Alex as a speaker. This is Alex Madva, and he is a Mellon postdoctoral fellow at UC Berkeley. He received his PhD in philosophy from Columbia University in October 2012. His work centers on questions that research in social psychology raises for the philosophy of mind, philosophy of race and feminism, and applied ethics, especially prejudice and discrimination. So why don't I just have Alex show you his stuff?
Is this on? Okay. That was quite an introduction. Thanks. Thanks to everybody for organizing this and for inviting me here. I'm really excited. This is a really cool opportunity. Okay, here we go. So, newsflash, overt prejudice is still a problem. 2014 was a big year for the NBA. We had the first openly gay athlete in men's professional sports, Jason Collins. Played for the Brooklyn Nets. So, seems like we're making serious strides as far as diversity goes, and then a few weeks ago, Donald Sterling, owner of the Los Angeles Clippers, was recorded saying just incredibly racist things to his girlfriend, telling her not to bring black people to his games, telling her not to be seen in photos with black people. And it was the response when this happened was really decisive and massive and swift. The players were on the verge of boycotting, and the NBA came out and just banned him, effective immediately from all basketball operations. It was a kind of really incredible groundswell of opposition and response. And of course, it's not just like explicit prejudice, overt prejudice is a problem in professional sports. So if you go online, you can find 29 celebrities who have been caught being racist, including Paula Deen and Mel Gibson, looking like Don Quixote. We're clearly not immune to it in the academy either, so famously Larry Summers in 2005, then president of Harvard University, in a speech where he was supposed to be provocative, suggested that sex differences between men and women having to do with intrinsic aptitude partly explain the disparity of women math and science professors. And once again, similarly to the case of Donald Sterling, there was this groundswell of opposition. The Harvard faculty made a vote of no confidence and kicked him out. While overt prejudice is still a problem, and while we know it when we see it, it's actually not the only problem. So, as much of a massive response as there was to Donald Sterling in the past few weeks, there was considerably less attention a few years ago when a study came out suggesting that there was racial discrimination among NBA referees. So the study found that if you had an all-white NBA referee crew, they tended to call slightly more fouls against black players. And if you had an all-black officiating crew, they tended to call slightly more fouls against white players. Of course, most of the refs were white, and most of the players were black, so you can imagine what the effects of that might be. And it added up to a couple points difference for the players who were involved, and it made a material difference in the outcomes of the games. And in fact, in a follow-up study, they argued that gamblers who factored in the racial bias of the NBA referees would even consistently beat the spread. So it's actually information that you could use to make money. But as I said, there was considerably less media attention in this case, and insofar as there was, it had a decidedly different cast. So there wasn't any outrage against the NBA or against the referees. Insofar as there was any outrage, it was towards the authors of the study, because they were calling our fair and balanced referees racist, which of course they never said anything like that in the study, but that was how it was interpreted. So you have folks like Charles Barkley commentator now who's a Hall of Famer, who said, "That might be the most stupid study I've ever heard. There are a lot more black players in the NBA, so of course there are going to be more calls by white referees against black players. But also, I bet black referees call more fouls against black players. For them to come out with a statement like that is irresponsible and it's asinine. It's stupid and it's not right." It's surely the case that there are more black players in the NBA, but of course the point of the study was proportions, percentage, on average, et cetera, et cetera. So that was the response, and it's like as if we don't have an overt bigot to blame and somebody to point the finger at who comes out and just says something clearly racist, we don't know what to do. When we switch from the context of overt prejudice to the context of subtle but persistent patterns of bias among well-intentioned people, it's like we don't know how to interpret or how to react. Right? And we don't know how to think or talk about implicit bias. So that's what I'm going to start doing today. I'm going to start thinking and talking about implicit bias. And I'm going to put an emphasis not on the NBA, as you might have guessed, but on higher education. So first, I'll describe a little evidence suggesting that there are widespread implicit biases in academia and beyond. I'll say a bit about where they come from. I'll say a bit about how these biases affect students and teachers, a kind of just survey of some highlights, or I guess you could say lowlights, of the ways that they influence us. And then I'm going to start talking about institutional and individual reforms. And I'm going to get it all done in 35 minutes. We'll see. Okay, so it's sort of unfortunate that we are only moved by overt prejudice, because as a matter of fact, overt prejudice has been on the outs. People are much less likely nowadays to explicitly report that they are prejudiced, that they believe in stereotypes, that they discriminate. So, for example, Michelle Alexander in the New Jim Crow in 2010 emphasized that a clear majority of Americans were telling pollsters in the early 1980s that they opposed race discrimination in nearly all its forms. Of course, psychologists were not fooled. People knew that prejudice did not just vanish. And there are basically two, broadly speaking, explanations for the decline in reports about overt prejudice. Number one, we're still biased, but we don't admit it. Maybe we just tell others what they want to hear, what we think that they want to hear. We say our beliefs, what we think people will like to hear. Maybe we deny that our ugly thoughts and feelings reflect our true selves. Maybe we acknowledge that we have prejudiced thoughts, but we say, that's not me, that's not what I'm about. And this way, it's sort of like someone who has kind of a phobia of clowns or something like that, who denies that they have the phobia in order to impress a date, or they even deny it to themselves because it's so irrational or something like that. So that's one potential explanation. And the second one is that we're still biased, but we don't know it. And in this case, it could be that unconscious prejudices persist despite our conscious commitments to be fair and unprejudiced. And spoiler alert, both explanations are partly true. And both of them are worrying, because in both cases, it brings home that just because discrimination is harder to detect, just because it's not on the surface, just because it's not overt, it doesn't mean it's not real, it doesn't mean it doesn't have real effects. And it means even if we mean well, if you have negative gut feelings and you choose not to act on them, that's great. If you have really strong commitments and you're not even aware of the possibility that you have biased thoughts or feelings, that's also great, but it might nevertheless be the case, there's good reason to think that all of us are nevertheless not living up to those commitments in all sorts of ways. So, as a result of this decline in reports of overt prejudice, a new search began for indirect measures of people's social attitudes, ways of getting around what people were willing to report to find either the attitudes that they're concealing or the attitudes that they don't even know that they have. The most popular kind of indirect test is the implicit association test, and I'll say a little bit about what that's like. I very much encourage you to Google Project Implicit and try out an implicit association test for yourself. They're pretty striking. Some of them are quick. You can get it over pretty fast. So how does it work? Basically, it's a sorting task. So let's start out with some easy sorting tasks. Suppose I ask you to sort a deck of cards as fast as you can into spades and clubs on the left, and hearts and diamonds on the right. Okay, that should be pretty easy. Similarly, if I ask you to sort the faces on the left and the numbers on the right, that should also be pretty easy. Those are pretty intuitive, natural ways to sort out these categories. Well, here's a slightly harder sorting task. Suppose I ask you instead to sort the hearts and the clubs on the left and the spades and the diamonds on the right. Now it's not going to be so obvious. And if I ask you to do it as fast as you possibly can, you're going to find it more difficult, it's going to take you longer, you're going to make more mistakes along the way. So we can do these sorts of sorting tasks with a computer. So suppose in this task, when you look at the computer screen, you're going to see an image. If you see a picture of an insect, I'll have you press the D key. If you see a picture of a flower, you'll press the K key. So, okay, insect, do, everybody? Okay, just making sure you're still paying attention. All right, if you see a flower, then you're going to press the K key. All right, so far so good. Similarly, I can ask you, if you see a negative word, such as hate, evil, or death, you're also going to press the D key. And if you see a positive word, such as love, pleasant, or good, you're going to press the K key. Okay? Again, these are pretty straightforward sorting tests. Now it's going to get a little more complex, because now we're going to lump two of them together. So now if you see a picture of an insect or a negative word, you're going to press the D key. So see these negative words. Press the D key. Okay, and then we see insects, we're going to press the D key. If you see a picture of a flower or a positive word, you press the K key. So positive words, I'll press the K key. You see flowers again, I'll press the K key. All right. Now, this is a more difficult task than the ones I was just talking about. But odds are that you're going to find this a relatively easy task in comparison to the alternative, which is to sort the positive words with the insects and the negative words with the flowers, unless you're a bug lover. And no offense to the bug lovers in the audience. So in this case, we tend to have negative gut reactions to insects and positive gut reactions to positive words like love, pleasant, and good. And so it's harder for us to sort those together on the same task. Now, so you might say that we find it more natural to associate flowers with positive and insects with negative than the alternative. So that's basically the implicit association test. And you can do it with any set of concepts, words, images that you like. So now let's turn to one that's more salient to the academic context. We're going to show you names. They might be boy names or they might be girl names. And I'm going to show you words that might either be related to math or that might be related to reading and language. So in this case, the student sees the word numbers on the screen. So that means she's going to go to the left because that's a math-related word. And as it turns out, just like in the case with the flowers and the insects, there are kind of more natural, more intuitive ways of grouping these words in some ways than other ways. So on the left side, we have the stereotype congruent way of grouping them, and that's when you put boys in math on the left and girls in reading on the right. And on the right side, we have case B, and that's the stereotype incongruent case, and that's when you have to group boys in reading together with girls in math. And even if you don't agree with Larry Summers that there are intrinsic gender differences in aptitude for math and language, most of us, men and women alike, will find A easier than B. So, for example, we'll find it easier to associate David with science and Sarah with literature. And so to have a stronger association means it's faster, you're more accurate in one context than the other. In one study, they took 500,000 participants from 34 countries, and they gave them this IAT here, where they were supposed to group men and women with science and liberal arts, and they found that 70% associated science with men, out of 500,000 people from 34 countries. Okay, so what, you might ask? What's the big deal just because I associate these things on a computer test? What difference does it make? Well, let me show you. As it turned out, this measure of implicit gender stereotypes predicted national gender differences in levels of science achievement among 8th graders. So you go to different countries, you find different degrees of these implicit associations, and those correlate with the different levels of science achievement for boys and girls in the 8th grade. In fact, this IAT measure predicted those things better than overt self-reports. When they added overt self-reports into the model, it didn't improve it whatsoever. So we have an indirect measure that's predicting these national trends independently of what people explicitly say about whether they endorse gender stereotypes or not. What else does the IAT predict? Here's a particularly striking one. This was a field study in Sweden, and it started out with submitting 1,500 job applications, some of which had Swedish-sounding names and some had Arab-sounding names. The applications were otherwise identical, and overall, the Swedish-sounding names on the job applications were 3 times more likely to get a callback for an interview. So we have pretty straightforward evidence for a hiring prejudice against Arabs in Sweden. 3 months after that, the researcher went to the employers, and 26% of those employers took an IAT comparing that was like a positive, negative Arab IAT. And the implicit preference on the IAT for Swedes over Arabs significantly predicted callbacks for interviews. So if you explicitly ask these folks, do you hire fairly? Are you equal opportunity employers? They'll say yes, but this implicit association test actually more accurately predicted the hiring trends. The list of things that get that are predicted by the IAT goes on and on and on. I'm going to get some water. I'm going to do a little Marco Rubio thing. Not Marco. That's the what's the Senator Rubio. Marco Rubio is the basketball player. Anyway, it is. Okay.
That's Ricky Rubio. You meant Ricky Rubio.
Ricky Rubio. Okay, just kidding. So it wasn't Marco. Right. Anyway, so there are some of my implicit prejudices. Okay. All right. So in one case, they went to voters who in Italy who said that they were undecided about who they were going to vote for in the upcoming election, and they gave them an IAT test 1 month in advance. And the IAT actually tended to significantly predict voting decisions among those who claimed to be undecided. So you got people who are verbally reporting, maybe sincerely, maybe not, I don't know, that's what they're saying. They're saying that they're undecided, but nevertheless, the IAT is actually predicting, not 100% accurately with it in every case, but that, overall their trends were already detectable on the IAT in advance. Of course, for most of us, our explicit political attitudes correlate almost perfectly with our implicit political attitudes. In a wide variety of cases, if you ask somebody, up front, which political party do you support? What's your view on this or that? Very often, people's explicit reports will line up with their implicit ones. But that's not the case in many other domains. For example, physicians' implicit racial biases, but not their explicit reports, predicted the quality of medical care they gave toward white versus black patients. So they would explicitly say, I treat all my patients equally, but nevertheless, their treatment recommendations tended to differ on racial grounds, and that was often predicted by an IAT on race. Studies like these are particularly striking in light of other findings, for example, that in the ER, black children tend to receive less pain medication than white children. Hispanic and black children tend to wait longer in the ER than white children. And this is so even when you control for all the other possible socioeconomic and demographic and regional variables that could be there. And so in many of these cases where we find patterns of discrimination or patterns of difference, there's not an IAT test to sort of point to an attitude there. But in some of the cases there is. So it's pretty clear that these implicit measures are onto something. Another thing that they predict are our unreflective social behaviors and our interactions with other people. So for example, in a 2002 study, a group of white college students first completed a race IAT for black-white bias, and then they filled out an explicit questionnaire that asked them about their reflective beliefs about racial stereotypes. And they also engaged in an interracial social interaction. They had a conversation with a black interlocutor. Ostensibly, it was just to discuss whether dating in the contemporary area is similar or different to earlier periods. And on the one hand, their explicit reports, their explicit beliefs were overwhelmingly anti-racist. They denied that they believed in stereotypes. And these explicit beliefs predicted their more conscious and controllable behaviors. So how friendly their words were, the content of what they were saying, the explicit utterances that they were making were relatively friendly, in line with their reflective beliefs. However, the race bias was widely found on the IAT, and this implicit racial bias predicted a number of their more tacit and subtle behaviors. For example, how rapidly they blinked. They blinked more when they were when they were talking to the black interlocutor than a white interlocutor. How far away they sat. They would position their chair farther away or closer up, depending on the race of the person they were interacting with. Whether they leaned forward or back. We had the Sheryl Sandberg shout out, so they were not leaning in in the cross-race case. How much eye contact they made with their interlocutor. How much they laughed at a joke. So even these very subtle things, and of course whenever you start talking about the micro behaviors, then you become totally self-conscious about your own posture. So I have to pretend that I'm invisible now to keep going. But okay, so where do these biases come from? Well, clearly, I mean, newsflash, the backdrop is that we grow up and remain immersed in societies and institutions that continue to be structured by visible disparities between social groups. We're bombarded with stereotypes in mass media, news coverage, fictional film, et cetera, et cetera. So, for example, they found that racial bias on the IAT increases after listening to violent rap music, but not pop. And it increases after watching television clips where white actors display subtle nonverbal bias towards black actors. And of course, in addition to just all of the inaccurate garbage that we get bombarded with in mass media, there's also de facto continuing segregation. Even though it's not explicitly on the books, we still live in a society that's largely where people's jobs and their housing and education are segregated in all sorts of ways. And we do observe that people from specific social groups are more likely to occupy certain roles in family, in education, wherever it might be, more likely to have specific jobs, to live in specific areas, and so on. So as a result, when we're talking about racial bias, about 80% of white Americans show an anti-black bias on the IAT, but it's not just a bias that whites have towards blacks, about 40% of African Americans also have a bias. And that said, it would be an overstatement to kind of just put it all on the stuff that's out there in the air and not to take any individual responsibility ourselves for the biases that we have. So these kinds of pervasive stereotypes and de facto segregation that we come across form, you might call it the background or the backdrop for implicit bias. But there are a lot of different individual habits and traits that can reduce or enhance the biases. So to take two actually in particular. So one is the difference between being internally or externally motivated to be unprejudiced. So on a questionnaire, if you're internally motivated to be unprejudiced, then you'll say you strongly agree to statements like, because of my personal values, I believe that using stereotypes about black people is wrong. So in this case, you say, it's my own personal values, it's an internal thing, that's why I don't believe in stereotypes. There are also external motivations. For example, if I acted prejudiced toward black people, I would be concerned that others would be angry with me. Now, in this case, it's not necessarily a personal important value that you have. It's that you're concerned that if you come across as prejudiced, people are going to be upset. If I'm being honest with myself, I do care what other people think. If other people think that I'm prejudiced, I don't like that. But as it turns out, people who report only internal motivations to reject prejudice show less implicit racial bias. People who tend to report more external motivations show greater biases, and people who report both, who say, I do care about it personally, but I'm also concerned about what others will think about me, and you're also more likely to have racial biases. So it's an example of how you really got to care about it for its own sake if you want to start to make progress. Another way in which it's not just about, our biases are not just about kind of what's in the air and what we get bombarded with, is that, think about a couple examples here. When we respond to stereotypes, perhaps unconsciously by thinking something like, there's a grain of truth in that. In many cases, that's not just a matter of the fact that you've seen so many examples of that before, that you've been so bombarded with it before. In many cases, thinking about that stereotype might actually help you feel better about yourself. And there's all sorts of interesting, complex ways in which this works. So It's not just a matter of members of dominant groups having prejudices against members of disadvantaged groups. It's even true for, if you're thinking about the prevalent stereotypes that affect members of professionally successful groups, stereotypically successful groups, WASPs, Jews, Asians, businesswomen. Often there are stereotypes that members of these groups are cold, that they're calculative, they're amoral, they're unfeeling, they're ruthless, they're cutthroat. Where do you think those stereotypes come from? Well, suppose you're watching a reality TV show, and it's about fabulously wealthy people, and then you turn to your loved one and you say, even though we ain't got money, I'm so in love with you. All right, well, it could be that what you're doing there is you're compensating. You perceive successful people from this other group on TV, and you think, okay, well, they can have all the money and the power, but they're actually cold and unloving. And that's unlike me and my family, and we're warm and loving, right? So it's a way of making yourself feel better. And it's not just a matter of like what's out there in the air that fills your head. There are all sorts of ways in which we're implicated. So it's definitely the case that most of this has to do with what we get bombarded with, but we're not just empty heads that get filled up with what we overall tend to encounter. Okay, so let's start talking explicitly, focus in on implicit bias in higher education. I'm going to go through a few examples of ways in which these biases affect us. There are biases this is one that I just came across, which is really striking, so that's why you get to hear about it. The way professors email their students, biases that come up in the classroom, biases in student evaluations of teachers, biases in hiring and promoting practices, and it's just going to be an overall pretty depressing picture of a million and one ways in which these biases affect us. Okay, so before a student even enters your institution, a prospective student might email a faculty member to express interest in coming, to ask questions, perhaps to ask about arranging a meeting in 1 week's time. So in one study, 6,548 professors received emails from fictional prospective doctoral students seeking to schedule a meeting. When the requests were to meet in 1 week, Caucasian males were granted access to faculty members 26% more often than women and minorities. Also compared with women and minorities, Caucasian males received more and faster responses. Even if you said no, you replied quickly and more often. Right? So here's some of the breakdown of the numbers. So people who get the most responses and the most positive feedback are Caucasian males, and then every step down you have less and less likely to get any response at all, the emails being ignored, and less and less likely to arrange the meeting. So by the time you get down to the bottom, Chinese women were 77% less likely to even receive a reply at all. So it's pretty striking. Once you get into the classroom, the biases continue. A large body of research shows that instructors call on male students more frequently than female students. By the way, so I'm focusing on race and gender biases primarily because that's what most of the research is on, but pick any social category you like, any intersection of social categories you like. It gets more complicated, but there are more biases and they're problematic in every single case. But this is what most of the research is on, and I only have a limited amount of time, so that's the focus. The professors, instructors are more likely to use male students' names when they call on them. They're more likely to say, oh, this relates back to so-and-so's point from earlier about such and such. More likely to ask male students about abstract questions and female students more factual questions. And they're less likely to elaborate on points made by female students. All of this holds both for male and female professors of all different ethnic backgrounds. And as a result, male students speak more frequently, and they blurt out answers more without raising their hand. Female students are interrupted more. They speak less, and when they do speak, they speak less loudly. And they hedge their claims more. They say, I might be wrong about this, I'm not sure, I think I remember, but it might be da-da-da. Even if you don't say a word, the environmental cues in the classroom can send a significant message. So suppose this was your computer science classroom. What do you guys notice about this classroom? Hopefully it's big enough and you can see. Is it too dark? Can we not see it at all? Okay. So this is a bust of Spock. This is a poster that says Star Trek. This is a poster that says Grand Theft Auto. Back here we have World of Warcraft. I think that one's Star Wars. Maybe you get the picture. Okay, here's another classroom you might come into. There's nothing in here. There's just sort of generic paintings and posters that don't really say anything. Okay, well, if you're a woman undergraduate student and you're thinking about majoring in computer science, well, when you walk into a classroom like this, you're going to be less interested in pursuing the subject, and you're going to underrate your chances of success in computer science. Women expressed less interest and anticipated less success in computer science, just from this sort of, without any explicit negative claims, just these cues in the air that sort of remind you of a sci-fi nerd had these effects, right? Because sci-fi nerds tend to be men, right? Of course, seeing these cues had no effect one way or the other on men, because that's sort of, in many cases they already were sci-fi nerds, so it sort of didn't register. But, so if you replace those stereotypical objects, if you replace those cues that signal this is what membership in this major is like, then there were dramatic increases in women's interest in computer science. Researchers said environments influence students' sense of ambient belonging or feeling of fit in an environment. And so cases like this are really striking because there's no overt ill will or anything sort of explicit that says you don't belong here, but you're just sort of, activating cues, maybe like the Big Bang Theory or something like that, that sort of say this is what, these are the sorts of people who do this sort of thing, and it sends a message, and the message is heard. You might think that all these little things are just tiny little effects that sort of don't add up. You might think that we're making a mountain out of a molehill, but as a matter of fact, mountains are molehills, built up one on top of the other, as Virginia Valiant says. And there's one demonstration of the power of all these little effects to add up. It was a computer simulation that showed the researchers simulated an 8-level hierarchical institution with a pyramidal structure. So they had a bunch of entry-level workers on the bottom, and they got narrower and narrower at the top as you sort of went up the hierarchy of power in the institution. That when the computer simulation started, there were equal numbers of men and women throughout the structure. But the model assumed a tiny bias in favor of promoting men, which accounted for only 1% of the variability in promotion. So they sort of let the computer simulation run, and the only change was that the only way that they weighted the scales was that men were 1% more likely to be promoted than women. After many iterations, the top level was 65% male. So even very small amounts of disadvantage can accumulate over time. Even if you're just putting your finger on the scale a little bit, if you do it over and over and over again in a million different spheres of our lives, then it's going to add up to be quite a lot. The way students evaluate instructors also reflect biases. So in some cases, the sort of parsing the data can be complex, but basically it looks like students tend to be biased against women faculty in a kind of conditional way. So female professors are seen as effective teachers when they're in intimate settings such as seminars, but less so when they're in larger classes and they're sort of giving big lectures and they have this have to have a big presence or something like that. Well, why is that? What's going on there? It seems like women instructors receive the highest ratings if the qualities they exhibit are both agentic and sensitive, which is to say they're both assertive and ambitious and they're, like go get 'em tiger kind of attitude, but at the same time that they also come across as nurturing and empathetic. So if you're in a small seminar classroom, you can sort of show your empathy for the students and fulfill some of the stereotypical gender roles for women, and that's going to get you high ratings. By contrast, men instructors don't need to be cuddly, touchy-feely, well, definitely not touchy-feely, friendly towards their students at all. All they have to do is be agentic. Right? If they're sort of jerks, it doesn't really harm their reviews. They still get the highest ratings. And of course, it's not just the way the students evaluate professors, it's also the way faculty evaluate the job applications that are coming in. So, a really striking study by Ullman and Cohen in 2005, I don't know if that's too small for you guys to read, found that participants evaluated 2 hypothetical candidates for a job as chief of police. Now, one of the candidates was described as having extensive street experience, but very little formal education. Another one of the candidates had extensive formal education, but very little street experience. So you sort of had 2 candidates. One had book smarts, but not street smarts, and the other one had street smarts, but not book smarts. Now, when the street smart candidate was male, and the book smart candidate was female, participants said that street smarts were most important for being an effective police chief, and they recommended promoting the man. However, when the street smart candidate was female, and the book smart candidate was male, participants said book smarts are the most important, and once again recommended promoting the man. Right? So, without even knowing it, right? Without even realizing it, they're unwittingly tailoring their judgments about what the tools are to be successful in this job to match the gut feeling that they had about who was better suited. Right? So there's a gut feeling like police chief, that's a male thing, and then you just sort of look for what's different about that application, and that's the thing you pick, and that's what you say is best. Of course, we are talking about higher education, and it turned out that you got exactly the reverse pattern if the job was chair of a women's studies department instead of police chief. Right? In that case, you found ways to say the woman is the right one for the job. Okay, now we're going to start turning towards how we can get out of this mess a little bit. There have been some really striking studies done on the power of counter-stereotypical role models. It began in a study from 2004 with Dasgupta and Asghari, where they found that after attending an all-women's college for 1 year, undergraduates had their implicit attitudes about gender and leadership qualities were radically overhauled. They started out having strong implicit associations with female names like Emily and traits like nurturing, and male names like Greg and traits like assertiveness. But after 1 year at this women's college, those implicit associations completely vanished. It was wiped out completely. They also found that attending 1 year at a co-ed university had the opposite effect. In this case, women had stronger associations with Greg with assertiveness after 1 year. But don't despair just yet. What do you think the difference was? Well, it turned out in this case it wasn't primarily about having a supportive or encouraging atmosphere in the women's college. It pretty much just boiled down to the total number of classes students had taken with women math and science professors. So in the all-women's college, they tended to have more women math and science professors, and in the, some thumbs up going around, yes, that's definitely encouraging study. And so it turned out that when you went back and looked at the data, regardless of which institution they attended, the biggest factor was just, whether they had had a few classes with women math and science professors. One of the striking things about this study, however, is that neither group, in any condition, showed any change in their reflective self-reported beliefs about women nurturing and leadership. Before, as well as after, at both institutions, after a year, whichever professors you had, participants explicitly reported that women possess more supportive qualities than leadership has. As a matter of fact, it looks like you can retrain just about any cognitive, affective, or motivational disposition you like, which is to say your beliefs, your emotions, and your desires. Similar intervention techniques that involve moving a joystick back and forth or pressing buttons on a computer keyboard over and over again can reduce implicit prejudice. Those social behaviors that I was talking about before can be changed. Making more eye contact, sitting closer in interracial interaction. They can reduce stereotype accessibility, reducing the likelihood of hiring a man over an equally qualified woman for a job, and they can even reduce susceptibility to stereotype threat, which I haven't said much about today. But women who retrained their math gender stereotypes up to 1 day later, 24 to 30 hours later, actually did much better on a math GRE and on tests of working memory. So without even realizing, in fact, in that case, that they were retraining their attitudes, it had significant effects on their performance on a math test. It's as if you're sort of just getting that stereotype out of your head, reducing the salience of it, and then you can just go and do your thing. So we've got influence on long-term recovery from addiction, implicit self-esteem. And one study, and actually in the very same paper, in study 1, they used a training technique like this to increase participants' implicit self-esteem. And then in study 2, they reversed their preferences for gummy bears versus milk chocolate. So I just invite you to consider the possibility that these sorts of training techniques could influence just about any psychological disposition you like. Would you rather approach voting and political marches? Would you rather dislike the status quo? Would you rather get outraged at injustice? Feel more compassion towards the disadvantaged? You name it, it might be malleable and within your power to do so. Okay, that might freak you out and make you uncomfortable, so let's talk about some less invasive procedures here. Basically, the moral of the story is you gotta have a plan. So I'm going to talk about some plans that students and faculty and everybody in general can employ to make it the case that our unreflective and sometimes even unconscious habits of thinking, feeling, and action are more in line with our reflective commitments about the people who we want to be. Basically, it's all about if-then plans. So if you really want to meet your goal, you've got to specify the when, the where, and the how of when you're going to do it. So for example, instead of just thinking, I'd like to cut back on smoking, you should form an if-then plan like, if I feel a craving for cigarettes, then I will chew gum. And it's really important that you have an exclamation point at the end of the plan. I don't know why, but that's just the way it is. Okay, so for, if you're talking about New Year's resolution, my New Year's resolution is to work out more. Okay, and many of you may have had that resolution. Here we are in May. I don't know how many of you stuck with it. Here's something that might work a little better. When I leave work on Tuesdays, then I will go to the gym. Now, research suggests that if you sort of pick out these specific contexts where you want to act differently, just specify those contexts, then it becomes almost like an instant habit where your attention is going to be drawn to that thing, and it'll be much easier for you to do the thing you want in that situation. And this is has more general implications for how we can be better and be less prejudiced against others and ourselves. You want to identify the problem context and then formulate concrete plans for how to act in those contexts. As you can guess, many of these plans are very easy to form, and it turns out they're easy to remember and they're easy to execute. Because it's almost like you're delegating control to the situation, so that when you see that cue, it just automatically makes you think of the thing to do. And many different reforms can be bolstered with these sorts of if-then plans. For example, are you more likely to interrupt women than men? Probably yes. How about this? If she's talking, then I won't. This is from Louise Anthony and also the philosopher. Right? Are you concerned about biases in the way you respond to your students in your class? If someone who hasn't spoken yet raises her hand, then I'll call on her. Hope that doesn't sound too onerous, something to plan to do. This is another one from Louise Anthony. If a student says something anomalous, then I will assume that the problem is that I don't understand, and not that the student doesn't make any sense. So rule of thumb, very easy to implement, and it can go a long way. If a quiet student says something, then I will refer back to her comment later. Okay? Just say it to yourself 3 times, and let it run on its own, and it'll make a pretty big difference. Are you a student emailing a professor? I was talking about the biases there. How about this? If I contact the professor, then I will make my qualifications clear. You attach your resume, name drop the person who told you about the opportunity, whatever it might be. Catherine Milkman, who did those studies, said, don't leave any ambiguity about your quality as a candidate. One reason why people discriminate is that they don't think you're going to be as good of a candidate. So show that you are. Attach your CV, say whom you've worked with. Any ambiguity can be used against you. So just attach your CV. Are you perhaps you're a prospective minority student and you're looking at a new institution? It turns out that you're more likely to get responses if you contact members of your own race or other differences in ethnic backgrounds. So how about this? If someone in the department shares my social identity, then I will reach out to that person. Okay? You can also reach out to other people too. So it doesn't have to be exclusively in this way. Are you a professor replying to students? Come up with some rule of thumb, some plan for how you're going to do it equally. Maybe this one is a little ambitious and asking a little much, but whatever you do, make it the same for everybody. If a prospective student emails me, then I will reply and try to schedule a meeting. Right? You want to put rules of thumb in place at the encouragement stage. If people in your organization are getting requests for assistance from potential applicants, instead of just responding with their gut instinct, there should be a policy in place for how to handle those requests. Try to respond uniformly across the board to everyone. And of course, this is a kind of plan that maybe, as a department, as a faculty, you should form together to make. Right? It's not something that just you as an individual have to do. Context, context, context. Especially in the US, we're very likely, when we see somebody act against the norm or underperform in some way, to think that that reflects some kind of negative character trait about them, that it reflects something about their work ethic or that they're unintelligent or something like that. Very often it has nothing to do with that. It has everything to do with the situation. There was some personal challenge that the person went through, there was a course load, they had 2 finals in the same day or something like that. So if you see someone underperform in a certain way, try to imagine situational causes. If you're, if you're like a white boss at the law firm, it could be that like when the black guy comes in late, you think that person's just lazy or something like that, but when your white co-manager comes in late, you think, oh, I'm sure there was a traffic jam, right? So whenever, when you see somebody, underperform in some way, then think about situational explanations that could have led to that, because those are probably the right ones. If you see someone act in a way that somehow seems to confirm the stereotype about that group, consider other possible explanations. Think about other things that might have led to that sort of behavior. And in general, you've got to sweat the small stuff, because every evaluation we make is important. All of these small differences can add up to considerable disparities in advantage and disadvantage over time. Right? So one kind of intervention that's really striking that's come out specific. So I'm a philosopher, and that's some of the biases that I'm most concerned about, and it's among the humanities, philosophy is the worst in terms of just overwhelmingly white men. And there's finally starting to be a kind of, hopefully, if we keep pushing, a trend away from that. And one of the things that they found has to do with syllabi construction. So in this a really interesting study done by Eddie Nahmias, actually can't pronounce his last name, and 2 of his grad students, Tony Adlerberg and Morgan Thompson at Georgia State, they were examining what's happening that's sort of like, why is the philosophy pipeline leaking women at so many different stages? They found that if you're just looking at intro classes, about 50% of the classes at Georgia State tended to be 50% of the students at Georgia State tended to be women. But then many fewer women took further classes after that. Why? Well, what's going on? It turned out, based on their data, that it wasn't so much about just having a woman professor, a counter-stereotypical role model. It wasn't just about having a friendly class ambiance where everybody got to speak and people didn't interrupt each other. Really what it boiled down to was whether the syllabus included at least 20% women. So history of philosophy is overwhelmingly male, and that's reflected on many intro syllabi. They just have a lot of men on it. So even if you're a woman professor and you have a really friendly class ambiance, if everybody on your syllabus, or except one, if everybody except one token person of color and one woman or something like that, that's sending the message that this is this is the group of people who do this thing. And there are quite a few wonderful women philosophers still coming today and throughout the history of philosophy, and it's no challenge. It's really no challenge at all to try to if you can just get to 20% of your syllabus reflecting more diversity, then that actually had the biggest role to play in keeping women in the philosophy pipeline. So please diversify your syllabus portfolios, and not just in a tokenizing way. Don't just stick one on there to sort of show that you're making a token effort. So, in general, our biases are most likely to influence us when we're distracted, when we're tired, when we're hungry, when we're upset, when we're stressed. Right? Those are when you're sort of least in self-control. That's when you're most likely to be influenced by biases. So in one sort of very striking case, they found that judges were more likely to grant parole requests immediately after meal breaks than before. So right after the lunch break, they were like, yes, everybody gets parole, you get a car, you get a car, you get a car. And then right before, after it had been hours since the break and they're really, really hungry, suddenly it's like extremely quick, no, guilty, you're going back to jail, no parole. Okay, so don't make important decisions on an empty stomach. Don't leave it till the end of that long, tedious meeting. Everybody's been fighting, everything's tense, you've been debating it. You know, have some snacks. Take a study break. A few people have gotten up and availed themselves of the snacks in the back. Great idea. You know, like, don't make the important decisions when you're fatigued. Give yourself an opportunity to think. One of the most important things you can do is to settle the criteria for your decision making in advance. So let's go back to that police chief study that I was talking about, where you tailored your judgments about whether book smarts or street smarts was more important, depending on whether it was a man or a woman who had those qualities. Well, all that they had to do to eliminate that bias completely was have participants say in advance which of the two criteria they thought was more important. Before you come to the decision, before you've looked at any of the candidates, you say, most important is street smarts or book smarts or whatever it is. Second most important is book smarts or street smarts or whatever it is. Once you commit yourself to those criteria, the bias just completely vanished in this case. Right? So you want to develop those criteria in advance and stick to them. And of course you want to bear in mind that you don't, when you say stick to those criteria, that's not to say like pick them arbitrarily and randomly and just sort of stick with them forever. Bear in mind that there might be more than one way to do a job well. You want to revisit and revise those criteria over time. After decisions have been made, go back and evaluate the effects of the strategies that you made. Did this decision procedure lead to the best candidate and things like that. And you want to collect and analyze data. As you're making these decisions, write it down and return to it later on. There's often ways to sort of make these criteria really accessible and intuitive. You just make a kind of simple checklist that sort of lays out the criteria, book smarts and street smarts, and you can, as you're reading the thing that you're evaluating, you can just check them off the list, right? Having rubrics for grading papers, criteria for evaluating applications. As you sort of start to form judgments about the application that you're looking at, you want to repackage the information so that it's in an accessible way, so you're not sort of just lost in a big philosophy case of sort of reading a difficult paper or something like that. Step back and kind of write up an easy-to-read list of the pros and cons about the candidate so that you sort of have it ready to hand and you're not just relying on your own memory. And you want to be careful that the criteria you're using are not themselves full of stereotypes because, for example, if in like law firms say if they're looking at billable hours, they might find that men tended to bill more hours than women, right? But if you're just thinking that how many hours you bill is the only relevant criteria, there's a good chance that that policy is going to favor people who are not primary caregivers over people who are primary caregivers. So that might not be a great criterion to emphasize. In general, one of the pernicious ways that these biases affect us is that there's a stereotype incumbency effect, where whatever the previous job holders were like for a particular job, we come to think that those traits are necessary for success in that job. So in a world where most of the previous job holders in positions of power are white men, we're going to think that the other traits that they have, like being jerks, are necessary for success. When as a matter of fact, that might be a kind of illusory correlation that doesn't really hold true. So you want to think about, how many successful and unsuccessful people have these traits? How many people who have this job have those traits? How many people who don't have this job have those traits, and so on? In general, you want to broadcast information. These criteria that you come up with about what you think are measures of success, what you're looking for, you should make it known. And you should, as someone who's looking for a job, you should seek that information. As someone who's offering a job, you should disseminate that information. You want to broadcast the expectations to everyone involved. So in some cases, merely spreading knowledge to the employees about what the criteria for promotion are can drastically reduce the disparities in representation of women and minorities up the food chain in the organization. As it turns out, most jobs and opportunities are not hired on the basis of just sort of sending out a CV somewhere and hopefully, with you and the 500 applicants, they pick out your job. And most jobs are hired via word of mouth. And this is an interesting case where that might have nothing to do with anybody's actual personal biases at all. It's just a structural habit where the people who are in your kind of word of mouth social network are going to hear about the job, and the people who are outside are not going to hear about the job. And without anybody intending to do anything wrong, you might only be broadcasting that information to people who are already privileged insiders. So instead, broadcast the information to other places, to people who might not get it. For example, don't just give your summer research position to the student who you know best. Maybe try to broadcast that position and make it available to a wider pool of people. I'm probably way over time, aren't I? I don't know. Yeah, okay. It's all about accountability. Make people responsible for these decisions. If you can imagine a world where people who predicted the weather got raises or demotions based on how accurate they were, what a wonderful meteorological world it could be. So once you set up these established criteria, you should be able to explain your decisions to other people in terms of those criteria. It often helps if you sort of have a task force or a committee who's devoted to the specific issue that you're trying to work on. Somebody whose responsibility is to see that these changes take place. You need to have top-down support from the people at the top of the institution. People who are in positions of authority saying, this is the way the new norms are, I support them, this is good stuff. And also among, in a kind of peer-to-peer way. You want to hear vocal endorsement of the norms. You want people to be talking openly about how, I used the new grading rubric and boy, was it, swell. And sort of be open about it. There's a phenomenon where leaders can legitimize other leaders, right? If you vouch for a new leader's expertise, then other people are going to think that that person's more of a leader. So it was really awesome for somebody to say that I was brave before I gave the talk, because, it's certainly not true, but it was, very awesome for legitimizing me for giving this talk now. As we've noticed these patterns of bias, we are seeing improvements when there have been targeted efforts to address them. A really striking example has been going on at MIT. So in 1999, it was found that MIT had been allocating much more lab space to, much less lab space to women than men faculty. And nobody realized this until a group of women started going through the labs with tape measures to measure things and prove it. Finally, when the evidence came out, the dean said, I believe that in no case was this discrimination conscious or deliberate. Indeed, it was totally unconscious and unknowing. He thought it was purely implicit bias. The president said, I have always believed that contemporary gender discrimination within universities is part reality and part perception. I now understand that reality is by far the greater part of the balance. So there was a kind of wonderful and sort of unprecedented and not often replicated top-down endorsement of the findings and saying this is a real problem and we really got to do something about it. They took responsibility for changing things, and once these facts were known, and 12 years later, a study looking back on the results found stunning progress. In 2011, 20 years later, they found that the number of women faculty had doubled. There were more women in leadership positions throughout MIT, and there were almost no remaining gender differences in salary, in lab space, in teaching loads, in available resources. So there was a concentrated effort, and it brought about very significant changes. At the same time, there were also some unintended consequences to be aware of. One thing that happened was it created a perception that women at MIT had an unfair advantage. They're sort of trying to shift the scales to sort of compensate for the pressure, and people thought oh, now they're getting all this extra help that they don't deserve. As a matter of fact, the increase, say, in the number of women faculties came from broadening job searches, not from lowering standards or using diversity reasons to give people tenure. In fact, women are aware that all of this is going on, and so they're often the ones most insisting on equity in using the criteria and sort of obviously nobody wants to have a job that they don't deserve, that they don't think that they deserve, that other people don't think they deserve. And they deserve them. It was, the changes that were made were just about, in this case, say, broadening job searches. Another kind of unintended consequence was that they formed a policy that every committee had to include at least one woman. Well, so the number of women faculty doubled, but it's MIT, and it's still, there's a radically more male faculty than women, and so when you have women as the minority among the faculty, that means that they're going to get called on again and again and again and again, the same people called on over and over again to be part of committee. And some report that they're losing up to 15% of their research time on the committee work. So, it's a good policy to have, but it has unintended effects. In general, women are reporting that they still have to battle expectations about their behavior. They can't be too aggressive, they can't be too soft. They report that childcare is still perceived as more of an issue for women. They get called to speak at conferences about new childcare practices in universities. It's always the women who are getting called to do those things and not the men. And of course, it shouldn't be an issue just for women, but that's still part of the perception. In general, in many fields, especially in math and sciences or philosophy and things like that, there are still many fewer tenured women professors in those fields. And of course, I hope it's clear at this point that it's not just about what often jumps first to people's mind, that women are losing time because they're getting pregnant and taking care of their babies or something like that. Even women who have no children are not often succeeding at the same rate as men. Right? So even when you control for all of these factors, those biases are still there. Those mountains are still are still growing out of molehills. Of course, it's also the case that you should offer child care and make policies with dual care couples and things like that. But I think one of the biggest take-homes is, this was really impressive about the MIT's response in 1999 when this happened, was humility. Willingness, being able to sort of let the finger be pointed at you and respond. We would all like to think that we're perfectly objective and fair. Unfortunately, we're not. In fact, the more objective you think you are, the more biased you're likely to be. And it's certainly the case that it's not like all of us have all of the same biases or that our attitudes to social groups are all the same. Not everybody has every possible bias. But I will stake my life on the claim that everybody has some biases sometimes. It's kind of like the awful version of everybody needs somebody sometimes. Everybody's biased against somebody sometimes, including ourselves. So everybody should be on notice. And as I was saying, there's a bias blind spot where we're often much better at identifying biases in other people than in ourselves. And the more objective you think you are, probably the more biased that you're likely to be. So here's a plan. I encourage we should all say it together at the end of this talk. If others call me out, then I will assume that they're right. This might be especially important for somebody in my position, say. Your first thought should be, okay, how can I do better? Not, is that accusation fair, and so on, right? And as I'm saying this now, I'm thinking that this is going to be, this plan it's more important for some people to form this plan than others. But in general, what happens and what you're kind of seeing in the MIT case is that even when we make progress, and we can, there's always a kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back process. Whenever we put new strategies and interventions in place, we tend to lose motivation to keep pushing. It's as if you sort of, once you have a new plan in place, you think, okay, my work here is done. And in a way, that's, it's arguably a kind of rational response to satisfying your goals. If you think that you've done better, then you sort of stop worrying about it. But as it turns out, this effect happens even if the interventions you put in place have no effect whatsoever. The mere presence of diversity initiatives, even if they do nothing, can sometimes sap our motivation to keep fighting, make people think that there's unfair advantages to disadvantaged groups that have to be compensated for. So what we should do is treat the effective interventions that we find as evidence that we can make progress if we keep trying, not as evidence that we've met our goals. So one more plan for us to have is when we make progress, then we will remind ourselves how much farther we still have to go. Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Alex, for that wonderful talk. Well, it looks like we all have our work cut out for us. have a question, and I'll move to you.
I don't need a mic.
Okay.
Sorry, big voice.
That's fine.
So, when you were talking about the I believe it was?
Yeah.
You said that 80% of white participants had a bias and 40% of blacks did. Is that
Yeah.
blacks towards white or blacks towards other blacks?
For the black pattern is about 40% have a pro-black bias, 40% have an anti-black bias, and there's 20% in the middle that don't have much of a bias at all. So it's a very common trend for people who are on the disadvantaged side of a lot of power relations. But there are other biases like regarding gender mass stereotypes where women are just as likely to have them as men, and in some cases more so.
Okay. So the population of women is increasing, the population of women attending college is increasing. How do you think that will affect implicit bias attitudes in other students?
That's a great question, and I hope it's not a terrible punt to say we don't know, because there's sort of two sides to it. On the sort of optimistic view is when you look at studies about the power of counter-stereotypical role models, you think, okay, we're going to expose people to counter-stereotypes, and they're going to think it's just going to melt their prejudices away. Unfortunately, when you look at things like what's going on at MIT, there's a possibility that seeing more members of these other groups, you might think, well, look at all the advantages they're getting, they don't deserve it. And any particular exposure to any particular experience in the world could reinforce or undermine your stereotypes depending on what you bring to the table. So the male students who have women math and science professors don't have any reductions in bias. So it sort of doesn't affect them at all. So there's a responsibility for each of us to, if you see a stereotypical representation on TV, like the way that they after Hurricane Katrina, when they showed black people going to the supermarkets, they were saying that they were looting. And when they showed white people going to the supermarkets, they were saying that they were fighting for their lives or something like that. When you see the stereotype, you got to say, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. And when you see a counter stereotype, you got to say, shine on, you crazy diamond. And it's what you're bringing to the table that's going to make a difference in those cases. So it depends in part on what the institutions do to encourage people how to frame them and how to interpret these things. So it's a big unknown.
Well, I have a question, which is that I've been following in the news pretty closely the investigation by the Department of Ed on universities and alleged mishandling and sweeping sexual assault and sexual harassment under the rug. And I'm kind of wondering what part you think that implicit bias might be playing into this situation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So actually in this case, I think, in a lot of cases, I think we're still up against full-blown explicit prejudice. In a lot of cases, I think, especially in philosophy, it's kind of mind-blowing how many big-shot professors are kind of being revealed as repeat sexual predators. So there's just a lot of explicit sort of kind of knowing bad behavior going on, and then implicit kind of boys will be boys, or kind of old-fashioned views about sexual harassment, you just got to take a joke or something like that. But I think in a lot of cases there's just explicit prejudice, and then people who don't know or don't want to know about it, and then I think there's a lot of what's going on are institutional features that don't necessarily implicate somebody's prejudice in particular, but it's just the way that the decision procedure works and stuff like that. So, but of course, I think implicit bias is everywhere. But I think, probably like a bias that, women are too sensitive or something like that. You should just be able to get over it or something like that. And then, all the victim blaming tendencies. What were you doing at the party and stuff like that. But a lot of that is pretty explicit, So,
Yeah, it's not even implicit,
Yeah.
it's explicit bias.
yeah.
I've got a quick question about this, the difference between implicit and explicit bias.
Cool.
I think from what I think I heard, it seems like they're fairly similar causes, and maybe it's fairly similar kinds of outcomes, maybe fairly similar kinds of ways to overcome the two kinds of biases. So then what is the difference between implicit and explicit bias?
That's a great question, and in some ways the search is ongoing, and in a lot of ways, in social psychology, the measures for attitudes there have been these sort of technological advancements for getting at these things, but the theoretical understanding of what we're measuring is sort of still lagging behind. So there are almost as many different views about what the difference is as there are sort of people working on the problem. I think that there are differences in how they change over time and how we can control them. So if you go back to like the counter-stereotypical math and science professors, the implicit attitudes changed in that case, but not the explicit attitudes. So women who had a number of women math and science professors still continue to report saying things like women tend to be more nurturing and men tend to be more assertive. And so the implicit stuff seems to be changing from exposure to counterexamples and sort of accumulating experiences that go against your attitudes. The explicit stuff is more like the values that people, because probably participants thought it's a good thing. Like, I like that, I'm a woman and I'm nurturing and that's good, and it's bad that men are cold and unfeeling and stuff like that. And in that case, their sort of explicit values were sort of filtering their ways of responding to the information. So in general, I think the explicit stuff has a lot more to do with our reflective beliefs and our patterns of inference and things like that, and our explicit values, and we sort of reason around those things. And our implicit attitudes are more these associations that build up over time in response to experiences. But there's all kinds of overlaps. So you can have a negative gut feeling about a certain group, and then you come up with reasons to justify that negative gut feeling. And then you've got an explicit attitude that's the tail being wagged by the dog of implicit attitudes. But it can also go the other way, because if you explicitly believe that women are more nurturing, then you're going to be more likely to seek out evidence that confirms that belief, and you're going to discount the evidence that disconfirms that belief, and if you see a counterexample, you're just going to say, oh, that's a particular subtype that doesn't sort of, so there's all sorts of ways in which the two can interact. But it's a really interesting and ongoing question.
Have there been any studies about, for the minority persons who are members of minority groups, who have been able to navigate through implicit and explicit bias environments? For instance, a female faculty member who's been able to, become department chair, or African American male who's been able to become a director in a particular corporation. What has been the key for them being successful?
That's a great question, there's lots of different, these are super multifaceted problems, and so it's something that to attack from a bunch of different angles. One sort of thing that I was talking about with Professor Yap before the talk was the difference between, like, if you're exposed to something like prejudiced behavior or potentially prejudiced comment or something like that. It's particularly hard for women and minorities if it's ambiguous whether it was really prejudiced or not. So if you're not sure, like, did they just say that because they, was that like racism just now, or was that something else? Those kinds of thoughts are actually more distracting than outright racism, because if somebody's outright prejudiced, you can just say, if I see a prejudiced person, I'm going to ignore them, that's a jerk, I'm not going to go that way, I'm going to work around that person or something like that. So one of the things to do is form plans to, like, how to handle these different kinds of situations. And so if you're encountering ambiguous prejudice, it's going to, I'm sure different plans are going to work for different people, and one part of it might be not worrying about it as much, but another part is going to be, finding a way to confront it, or to talk to somebody else to confront it, and sort of not stressing about it and just dealing with it. You know, there's all kinds of room for sort of social skills and tact, but in general, it's better to say something than to not say anything at all. And even if you sort of call somebody out for acting inappropriately, and either they like outright deny it and say, that's not true at all, how could you say that? Probably they're going to change their behavior. So even when people deny the racist label that you put on them or something like that, if they get called out, they're probably going to change their behavior. I think there's a lot of room for retraining our attitudes about the stereotypes that most harm us. So as I was saying, you can do that sort of retraining technique for the stereotypes that affect your own group. So women who retrained their math gender stereotypes were actually better on math tests the next day. Of course, nobody's like releasing the Rosetta Stone software to remove our prejudices. Feel free to do it, please. I haven't copyrighted it. I hope somebody does it. But there are other much more low-cost interventions like merely kind of like, affirming what's important in your life before you take one of these tests that you're stereotyped to underperform in. Just reminding yourself what you value, even if it's not related to the test you're about to take, can actually neutralize the effects of those stereotypes. So, so there's a lot of room for that. And, the list goes on, but there's lots of little things like that that can go a long way.
I'm curious about the implicit by IET, how you might be able to adjust that to, I mean, you were saying that you could adopt it to other classes and of classifications, and I know in our class, and several classes in the business class, we talked about sustainable consumerism and other similar models. I'm curious how you could adapt that and see implicit biases there and cut cross-section that with race and gender. I mean, other, because one thing is to break the glass ceiling, but you could still be exploiting your own people, so to speak, right? Okay. So there's other issues that you can kind of. So I guess I'm curious, and I think a lot of it, what we're learning is that, consumption philosophy and approaches is kind of cuts across everywhere, right?
Yeah.
And, so I'm just curious, what's your thoughts right now?
Yeah, so, I think it's, as I was saying, everybody's on notice, so you could be a super great campaigner for one important cause, but be a total failure in other dimensions of your, social and moral life, as many of the great moral leaders of the past 2,500 years have been. So I think, in general, everybody's on notice. Nobody is sort of like an actual, no human beings are actual transcendent figures who are not susceptible to these things. So, I think, again, I think one part of it is being receptive to being called out. If you are making progress on some dimension, but then there's another group who says there's this other important thing you got to pay attention to, don't say, after the revolution, then all of that will be taken care of. You've got to be open to it and be receptive to being called out and respond when it happens. Specifically for IATs for sustainability, I'm sure, I don't know how, it's tough to do full-blooded intersectionality kind of stuff on IATs and looking at how different problems interact with each other. But it's sort of you can sort of see the basics. There's a basic vocabulary that we sort of work with that gets more complicated. So probably retraining people to like the color green more, within the right marketing campaign would help them, be more. I think also so much of the sustainability stuff is about habits and turning off the lights and a lot of those things are things that sort of, if you can just kind of put the right environment in place to encourage them and the right kind of habits and intentions in place, then you get a kind of mutually reinforcing thing to sort of move the dial a little bit.
So I think we have room for one more question.
Sorry I ate up so much time to talk.
We have a student over there.
I have only a small question. How big is the effect from the society of the individual? bias, and who have differences in the different cultures or countries maybe. I think, okay, how is it in, I don't know, Africa, Asia, Europe? Is there are big differences to the US or?
There are differences, and it depends a lot. I mean, it's definitely, a lot of our biases are kind of calibrated to who's in power that we're kind of most exposed to. So children learn very early on kind of the pecking order of, even like in some very surprising ways about which social groups are most powerful and which are not. And at the beginning, kids will just explicitly say, yeah, I like these people more than those people. And actually what they learn how to do as they get older is not to say those things because they're socially inappropriate. And so they kind of learn to, like, it's not cool to think these things, and so I'm not going to say it out loud. So it's definitely like calibrated to the specific patterns of specific places, but MTV is everywhere, so although there's variability, there's a lot of overlap.
Thanks, Alex. Let's thank our speakers.
Thank you, guys.
Two quick things. One is, please take some food on your way out, especially because it's really for the students. And also, I know most of the students here are business students, and in preparation for this, I accumulated a lot of articles and books on implicit bias in business. So if you're interested, just email me. I'm a math professor here, and it's like all of our email addresses, shirley.yap@csueastbay.edu. So thanks again for coming.